My name is Sarah Chen. I'm 31 years old, and I'm a freelance graphic designer based in Portland, Oregon. I've built my business from absolutely nothing over the past 5 years, working 16-hour days, surviving on coffee and determination. Now I work with tech startups and creative agencies across the Pacific Northwest. My designs have been featured in Communication Arts magazine, I've won 3 regional design awards, and I make more money than most people my age. But to my mother-in-law, Margaret Stevens, what I do has never been real work. "Still playing with your little art projects?" she'd ask at every family dinner, her voice dripping with that particular brand of passive aggression that wealthy women perfect over decades of country club lunches. As if creating brand identities for million-dollar companies was the same as finger painting in kindergarten. "When are you going to get a real job, dear?" My father-in-law, Robert, was more direct, but equally dismissive. He'd lean back in his leather chair, swirling his whiskey, and say things like, "Sarah, wouldn't it be nice to have a stable job? Something with benefits, health insurance, a pension?" As if my 6-figure income was play money and my creative work was just a phase I'd eventually outgrow. The night Margaret slipped something into my drink, thinking I wasn't looking, that familiar knot in my stomach finally made sense. I'd been feeling uneasy all evening, but I'd attributed it to exhaustion and the general stress of being in that house. "Special cocktail for my favorite daughter-in-law," she said with that practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. The same smile she'd given me for 3 years while systematically undermining everything I cared about. I thanked her politely, the way I'd been trained to do since childhood, and discreetly switched glasses with Robert, who was busy scrolling through his phone, probably checking his portfolio or reading financial news. He barely looked up when I placed the glass in front of him. 45 minutes later, Robert was violently sick in their pristine marble bathroom, and I knew with absolute certainty that my mother-in-law had tried to drug me. Let me back up and tell you how we got here. I met my husband David 3 years ago at Powell's Books, of all places. I was sitting in the coffee shop section, working on a particularly challenging logo design for a sustainable fashion startup, my laptop surrounded by sketches and empty espresso cups. I was completely absorbed in my work when this guy approached my table. "Excuse me," he said, and I looked up to see these warm brown eyes and a genuinely apologetic expression. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I couldn't help noticing your work. I'm a software engineer, and I've never seen anyone design like that, the way you're thinking through the problem visually." That was David. No pickup line, no false confidence, just genuine curiosity about my creative process. We ended up talking for 3 hours. He was a senior developer at Nike, working on their mobile applications, and he had this wonderful way of explaining complex technical concepts that made them sound like poetry. We connected instantly over our shared love of creativity, problem-solving, and independence. We both worked unconventional hours, both were building something from nothing, both understood the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and functional. Our first few months together were magic. Long conversations about design and technology, weekend trips to the coast, quiet mornings working side by side in coffee shops. Then I met his parents. The Stevens family lived in a sprawling Tudor-style house in the West Hills, the kind of neighborhood where every lawn is perfectly manicured and every BMW is freshly washed. Old Portland money, the kind that comes from generations of smart investments and careful social positioning. Robert was a partner at a prestigious investment firm downtown. Margaret had been president of the Junior League, served on multiple charity boards, and spent her days managing their social calendar and their reputation. From our very first meeting, Margaret made it clear she had different expectations for her son's partner. There was Jennifer, she mentioned frequently, the kindergarten teacher from their Episcopal church, sweet, traditional, ready to be a housewife and mother. Jennifer had grown up 2 blocks away, had known David since childhood, came from the right kind of family. Then there was me, the girl who worked odd hours, traveled for clients, wore vintage clothing instead of department store suits, and didn't immediately express enthusiasm about having children. I was what Margaret called, with barely concealed disdain, artistic. Marriage should be a woman's priority, Margaret would say during those early dinners, usually while I was right there, as if I were invisible. Career comes second to family. That's just the natural order of things. Robert was subtler, but equally dismissive. He'd ask about my hobby with air quotes, suggest I consider teaching art instead because it was more stable, better for when you start a family. He'd quiz me about my retirement savings, my health insurance, my 5-year plan, as if my creative work was inherently unstable and irresponsible. The worst part wasn't their disapproval. I'd dealt with people who didn't understand creative work before. The worst part was watching David shrink a little bit more each time we visited them. The confident, passionate man I'd fallen in love with would become quiet and apologetic around his parents, as if he were somehow failing them by choosing me. Over the months, I started noticing things. Small things at first. Margaret would schedule family events during my biggest client presentations, then act surprised when I couldn't attend. "Oh, I forgot you had work," she'd say, making work sound like a dirty word. When I did attend family gatherings, she'd introduce me to her friends as David's girlfriend who does art instead of David's girlfriend who runs her own design studio. She had a way of asking questions that sounded supportive, but were actually designed to highlight my insecurities. "How's business, dear? Are you getting enough clients? It must be so stressful not knowing where your next paycheck is coming from." This while standing in their kitchen that cost more than I made in 6 months. Robert was more direct. During one particularly uncomfortable dinner, he suggested I might want to consider diversifying my skill set by getting a real estate license or maybe going back to school for an MBA. "Something more practical," he said. "Something that shows you're thinking about the future." When David and I moved in together, Margaret's comments became more pointed. She'd ask about our living situation, then mention how Jennifer had just gotten engaged to a nice doctor and was already looking at houses in Lake Oswego. She'd clip articles from magazines about career women who waited too long and leave them on David's desk when we visited. The breaking point should have been last Christmas. We were opening presents in their living room, a room that looked like it had been decorated by a professional interior designer, which it probably had been. Margaret had given me a cookbook titled Simple Meals for Busy Women and a set of dish towels. David got a Rolex. "I thought you might want to learn some basic homemaking skills," Margaret said sweetly as I held up the dish towels, "for when you're ready to settle down." David didn't say anything, just stared at his watch and mumbled something about how generous his parents were. That night I told David we needed to have a serious conversation about boundaries. He was defensive at first, claiming his parents meant well, that they just wanted the best for us. But when I pointed out that the best for us apparently meant me giving up everything I'd worked for to become a housewife, he got quiet. "They're just old-fashioned," he said finally. "They'll come around." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him. But deep down, I was starting to realize that Margaret and Robert weren't going to come around. They were going to keep pushing until either David chose them over me, or I broke under the pressure and left. I just didn't realize how far they were willing to go. Fast forward to Margaret's 58th birthday dinner. I'd just returned from a week-long branding workshop in Seattle, where I'd presented my work to a room full of industry professionals and received a standing ovation. I was riding high on professional success, exhausted but exhilarated. I'd even landed a new client, a sustainable jewelry company that wanted to launch nationally. David was proud, I could tell. He kept mentioning my presentation to his coworkers, forwarding me congratulatory emails, talking about how talented I was. For the first time in months, I felt like we were a team again, like we were building something together. But when David mentioned his mother's birthday dinner, my stomach dropped. "Just a couple hours," he promised. "We'll eat, sing happy birthday, and leave. I know you're tired." I should have trusted my instincts. I should have said I was too exhausted, that I needed to rest. But David looked so hopeful, so eager to share my success with his family, that I agreed. The Stevens house was exactly as I remembered. Imposing, perfectly maintained, cold. Margaret answered the door wearing a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her silver hair styled in perfect waves. She hugged David warmly, then turned to me with that practiced smile. Sarah, darling, she said, air kissing my cheek. How was your little trip to Seattle? Little trip, not successful workshop or professional development. Little trip, as if I'd gone shopping for the weekend. It went really well, I said, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. I actually landed a new client and made some great connections in the industry. How nice, Margaret replied, already turning away. Robert's in the study. Why don't you go say hello while I finish up in the kitchen? The evening started normally enough. Robert emerged from his study wearing a cashmere sweater and perfectly pressed khakis, shook my hand with his usual firm grip, and asked about my art business, with what might have been genuine interest if you didn't know him well enough to recognize the condescension. David's younger sister Emma and her husband Michael were there too, along with their 2-year-old daughter Sophie. Emma was a pediatric nurse, Michael was a high school teacher, and they were exactly the kind of couple Margaret approved of. Stable jobs, traditional roles, already producing grandchildren. During cocktails, Margaret regaled us with stories about her charity work, the upcoming fundraiser she was organizing, the important people she'd been meeting with. Robert talked about the market, his latest investment wins, a golf trip he was planning with his partners. Emma and Michael discussed Sophie's preschool applications and their plans to buy a bigger house. I contributed when I could, but my work didn't naturally fit into their conversations. When I mentioned my new client, Margaret changed the subject to Emma's upcoming promotion. When I tried to explain the branding strategy I'd developed, Robert interrupted to take a phone call about some urgent business matter. By the time we sat down for dinner, I was feeling invisible and increasingly frustrated. The food was excellent. Margaret had always been a good cook, but the conversation continued to revolve around everyone else's achievements while mine were politely ignored or dismissed. Then came dessert, and Margaret's announcement that she'd made her famous sangria to celebrate. She disappeared into the kitchen, and I offered to help carry glasses, partly out of politeness and partly because I needed a break from the dining room. That's when I saw it. Margaret was standing at the granite island, her back to me, with several glasses arranged in front of her. Most of them were identical, filled with the same deep red sangria. But 2 glasses were separate from the others, sitting on a different part of the counter. As I entered the kitchen, I watched her quickly add something from a small vial into one of those glasses. It wasn't a garnish, it wasn't a flavor enhancer. It was a clear liquid that she poured quickly and then immediately tucked the vial into her apron pocket. The glass she'd doctored had a barely perceptible film floating on top, catching the light from the pendant lamps above the island. My throat tightened. My heart started pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it. "Oh, Sarah, I've got this," she said, spinning around with that practiced smile, but her eyes were wide, startled. "This one's for you, special recipe for my favorite daughter-in-law." She handed me the glass with the film on top, and I noticed her fingers were trembling slightly. Just slightly, but enough to confirm what I'd seen. "Let me help you carry these," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. I took both glasses she'd prepared, the doctored one meant for me, and the clean one she'd prepared for someone else. In the dining room, Robert was scrolling through emails on his phone, barely looking up when I approached the table. He was sitting directly across from where I'd been seated, perfect positioning for what I needed to do. "Sangria for you, sir," I said cheerfully, placing the tampered glass in front of him instead of in front of my own place setting. "Thank you," he mumbled, still looking at his phone. I set the clean glass at my place and sat down, my hands shaking under the table. I made an excuse about preferring water with dessert, something about being dehydrated from my flight. Margaret's eyes tracked my movements, but she couldn't say anything without revealing what she'd done. For the next 45 minutes, I watched and waited. I made small talk with Emma about Sophie's developmental milestones, listened to Michael's stories about his students, complimented Margaret on the chocolate cake, all while keeping one eye on Robert's glass. He drank it slowly, in small sips, between bites of cake and bursts of conversation about his golf game. I found myself silently counting each sip, wondering what exactly Margaret had put in there, how long it would take to work, what would happen when it did. I didn't have to wait long. At first, it was subtle. Robert's face started looking pale, and he kept wiping his forehead with his napkin. Then he started shifting uncomfortably in his chair, pressing his hand to his stomach. "You okay, honey?" Margaret asked, but her voice sounded strained, artificial. "Must be something I ate," Robert muttered, then stood up quickly. "Excuse me." He made it halfway to the bathroom before the violent retching started. We could hear everything through the thin walls, the running water, the horrible sounds of someone being violently sick, Margaret's voice through the bathroom door asking if he needed help. David jumped up to check on his father. Emma started clearing dishes. Michael entertained Sophie to keep her from being scared by the noise. And I sat there, eating my chocolate cake, watching Margaret's face drain of all color as she realized what had happened. Her eyes met mine across the chaos, and in that moment, we both knew. She had tried to drug me, and I had switched the glasses. She knew that I knew, and I knew that she knew I knew, but I didn't react. I didn't confront her, didn't make a scene, didn't announce to the family what had happened. I just finished my cake, helped clean up the dishes, and expressed appropriate concern for Robert's sudden illness. "Must have been something bad in the seafood," Margaret kept saying, her voice getting higher and more strained with each repetition. "Food poisoning, that's what it is. Food poisoning." Robert spent the next hour in the bathroom, weak and shaky, insisting it was just a stomach bug, nothing serious. Margaret hovered around him, bringing him water and crackers, playing the concerned wife perfectly. David and Emma were worried but not suspicious. After all, food poisoning happens. Before we left, I quietly pocketed the untouched glass that had been meant for me, wrapping it carefully in a dinner napkin and slipping it into my purse. Evidence, though I wasn't sure yet what I'd do with it. During the drive home, David was quiet, worried about his father. "I hope he's okay," he said. That came on so suddenly. "I'm sure he'll be fine," I replied, staring out the window at the Portland skyline. These things happen. But inside, something had fundamentally shifted. The anger I felt wasn't hot or explosive. It was cold, calculating, patient. Margaret had tried to drug me, probably to make me miss something important or to make me appear unreliable or unstable in front of the family. She had been willing to risk my health, my safety, my reputation to get what she wanted. I wasn't going to let this go. But I wasn't going to fight their way either, with drama and confrontation and family meetings. I was going to make them face exactly who they were, systematically and undeniably. The game had changed, and Margaret didn't even know it yet. Monday morning, I took the glass to my former client, Jake Morrison, who ran a private toxicology lab in Beaverton. Jake and I had worked together on a public health campaign the previous year, and I trusted him to be discreet. "Personal or professional?" he asked when I explained what I needed. "Family matter," I replied, which was technically true. "I can have results for you by Thursday," he said. "But Sarah, if someone tried to drug you, you should consider calling the police." "Let's see what the test shows first," I said. 3 days later, Jake called me at my studio. "Sarah, we need to talk. Can you come in?" I drove to his lab immediately, my heart pounding. Jake was waiting in his office, looking serious and concerned. "There were benzodiazepines in that glass," he said without preamble. "Specifically, Xanax, a lot of it. Not enough to kill someone, but more than enough to knock them out for hours, maybe cause significant memory loss." I felt the blood drain from my face. "How much?" "About 10 times the normal therapeutic dose. Whoever consumed this would have been completely incapacitated." He leaned forward, studying my face. "Sarah, where did you get this glass?" I asked for a written report and didn't answer his question. But as I drove home, the full implications of what Margaret had done hit me. She hadn't just tried to make me slightly sick or embarrass me in front of the family. She had tried to drug me with enough Xanax to render me completely unconscious and vulnerable. The question was why? What had she been planning to do while I was unconscious? What story would she have told David and the rest of the family about what happened to me? Over the next 2 weeks, I did some digging. I started with Margaret's medical history, which was easier to access than you might think. I reached out to a friend who worked in medical billing and asked some carefully worded questions about prescription patterns and doctor shopping. What I found was disturbing. Margaret had prescriptions for Xanax from 3 different doctors. She'd been filling prescriptions at multiple pharmacies for months, accumulating enough pills to stock a small pharmacy. She was either severely addicted or stockpiling medication for some other purpose. I also started asking questions around their neighborhood and social circle. Very carefully, very discreetly, but I asked. There were rumors. Strange behavior at neighborhood parties where Margaret would disappear for long periods, then return acting odd. Accusations of theft at her country club. Small things like jewelry and credit cards that were never proven, but were whispered about. Stories about her being asked to step down from charity boards due to personality conflicts. The Stevens family had money and connections, and they'd worked hard to bury these stories. But the stories existed, and with a little patience and the right questions, I found them. I compiled everything into a file: the toxicology report, the prescription records, witness statements from people who'd seen Margaret's strange behavior. I printed it all out, organized it chronologically, and waited for the right moment to use it. My opportunity came sooner than expected. 2 weeks after the birthday dinner, David mentioned that his mother wanted professional headshots taken for some charity board application. She specifically asked for you, he said, which surprised both of us. Margaret had never shown any interest in my photography skills before. She said she wanted someone who would make her look dignified and professional. I agreed immediately. This was exactly the opening I needed. The following Saturday, I arrived at the Stevens house alone, camera bag in one hand, sealed manila envelope in the other. Margaret was waiting for me, dressed in a navy blue suit, her makeup and hair styled perfectly. She looked every inch the respectable society matron she pretended to be. Robert was conveniently at the office, she explained, something about an urgent client meeting. We were alone in the house, just the two of us. Before we start, I said, setting down my camera bag and pulling out the envelope, I thought you might want to see this. Margaret's face immediately changed, wariness creeping into her expression. What is it? I handed her the envelope without saying anything. She opened it with trembling fingers and began reading the toxicology report. I watched her face go through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, fear, and finally, a kind of cold calculation. This is absurd, she said, but her voice was shaky. I would never— We both know what happened that night, I interrupted, keeping my voice calm and level. What I don't know is why. What were you planning to do while I was unconscious? Her face hardened, and for a moment I saw the real Margaret, not the polite society matron, but the woman who was capable of drugging someone's drink. You're not good enough for my son, she said, her voice low and vicious. You never will be. A woman should provide stability, security, a future, not whatever it is you think you're doing with your little art projects. And drugging me was going to provide that? It wasn't going to hurt you, she snapped, but I could see the lie in her eyes. Just make you miss that ridiculous gallery opening you wouldn't shut up about. Show David that you're unreliable, that you can't handle real responsibility. I let that sink in. She had been willing to drug me, to risk my health and safety, just to make me miss a professional event and appear unreliable to David. Here's what's going to happen, I said, taking the envelope back from her shaking hands. You're going to tell Robert what you did. Then you're both going to start treating me with respect. Not because you've suddenly realized I'm good enough for your son, but because the alternative is David finding out exactly who his parents really are. Margaret laughed, but it sounded hollow and desperate. He'd never believe you over us. We're his parents. We've been taking care of him his whole life. That night, Margaret called me, pretending to be concerned. Sarah, dear, I'm worried about you. The things you said today. Are you feeling okay? I knew exactly what she was doing, trying to rewrite the narrative, to make me seem unstable. David came home shortly after, confused and clearly shaken. My mom called. She says you were acting strange. Is everything all right? I didn't argue. I showed him the lab report, the prescription records, and the footage Lisa had sent me. I told him everything, calmly, clearly. He was silent. Then, my mother wouldn't do this, would she? She did, I said. And I need you to see her for who she really is. The next day, David confronted his parents. Margaret denied everything, at first. But when he showed her the report and the footage, her mask cracked. Fine, she snapped. I did it. I had to. She's not right for you. David stood up, voice trembling. You drugged the woman I love. We're done. We left. She screamed after us, but her words meant nothing anymore. Weeks passed. David barely spoke to them. Margaret sent messages, half apologies, half threats. Then Lisa sent us the video footage, clear proof of what Margaret had done, and worse, what she'd planned. She wasn't just toxic, she was dangerous. David cut ties completely. I finally felt safe, not just from Margaret, but from the version of myself that had once tolerated her. She tried to ruin my life to protect her son, but in the end, I protected him from her. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and comment for more stories.